Has Bashar al-Assad leveraged disaster for political gain? This is northwest Syria. 12 years of indiscriminate aerial bombardment, a crippling siege by Bashar al-Assad's government, and limited international assistance have devastated the infrastructure of Syria's last opposition-held region, leaving it particularly vulnerable to sudden disaster. So when two earthquakes measuring 7.8 and 7.5 on the Richter scale hit the region on the 6th of February, the devastation was huge. Just 23 kilometers away in regime-held Aleppo, and 5 days after the earthquake, a smiling Assad made his first public appearance. Images of the Syrian president taking selfies with his supporters and visiting hospitals began appearing on social media. Assad found himself at the center of attention, fielding condolence phone calls from fellow Arab leaders, accepting aid from Gulf states, and receiving the red carpet treatment on his regional trip to Oman. After years of political isolation, earthquake diplomacy presented an opportunity for the Syrian president to rehabilitate and legitimise his leadership in the region. On the 12th of November 2011, Syria was thrown out of the Arab League over its deadly repression of anti-government protests. Arab states followed in the footsteps of the US, Canada, and the EU, which later implemented economic sanctions on Bashar al-Assad. But 12 years on, with an estimated 500,000 Syrians dead and 13 million displaced, Assad's isolation from its Arab neighbours had begun to thaw. Just a few months ago, during the November 2022 Arab League summit, hosts Algeria as well as other member states were calling for the reinstatement of Syria. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, which killed more than 5,900 people in Syria, a new opportunity to escalate the country's integration into the region presented itself.
The Assad regime really has been using the earthquake to leverage regional support. We've seen a variety of responses. Governments which had previously shunned Assad, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, sent aid and or condolences over the phone. And then we also saw friendly governments such as Bahrain, UAE, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, also speaking to Assad, sending aid, sending diplomats.
Countries like the UAE that had once funded rebels to overthrow Assad were now pledging $100 million in aid to the Syrian government after the quake.
In the Arab world, there is a consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. We all have policies, but we don't have any strategy to implement that policy.
Saudi Arabia, which opposed the Syrian government, particularly for its close alliance with its regional arch-rival Iran, came out and declared that the Arab world was looking for a new approach to Syria to respond effectively to humanitarian crises. Relations have been thawing steadily over the years, and states like the UAE and Oman have been at the forefront of a trend to bring Assad back into the regional fold. In 2018, the UAE reopened its Syrian embassy, and last year, Assad visited Abu Dhabi and Dubai in his first trip to an Arab state since the start of the Syrian war. Assad's first visit to the region post-earthquake was to Oman, where he was greeted by Sultan Haytham bin Tariq and given the red carpet treatment, helping to legitimise and rehabilitate his image even further.
It's not the beginning, it's not a thawing of relations. The relations have already been thawed. And Oman is seeing itself as essentially a broker to welcoming the Assad regime into the rest of the region. I do believe that this Oman trip will be the start of other similar visits in the region for the Assad regime, and you can really see how the Assad regime was really leveraging this earthquake, really showing that it is the sole leader of Syria, and it is now seeking help from other countries, through its diplomatic ventures.
All what we want from Europe and the US now is to lift sanctions. If they lift sanctions, the Syrian expatriate and the Syrian people would be able to take care of their country.
2 days after the devastating quake hit north and west Syria, advisor to President Bashar al-Assad, Buthaina Sha'ban, appeared on Sky News calling for an end to US and EU sanctions. This narrative was echoed on social media, civil society groups, and Western media. Those against sanctions maintain that easing restrictions would allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need. The US dismissed these demands.
It would be quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government that has brutalized its people over the course of a dozen years now, gassing them, slaughtering them, being responsible for much of the suffering that they've endured.
Sanctions are a contentious issue. Many critics of the Assad government argue that they protect Syrians by cutting off government resources to launch military campaigns against those most vulnerable in northwest Syria. Syrian activists have warned that Assad is in fact using the earthquake to foster sympathy and to portray the country as victims of the West. They argue that sanctions do not impact humanitarian aid.
It's very important to note that the impact of sanctions on the humanitarian response is hugely exaggerated. It's exaggerated primarily by the regime. We see how the regime is actually portraying sanctions. It basically argues that sanctions are the reason behind all troubles that Syria is facing, which is factually incorrect. The number one reason, I would say, is the thuggery of the regime against its own people, against its own cronies.
النظام السوري يعني من بداية الحرب في سوريا، من بداية الثورة السورية، يعني بدأ يستخدم المساعدات الإنسانية كسلاح سياسي، وهذا الكلام تجلى بشكل كتير كبير في منطقة الغوطة، في مناطق المحافظات اللي كانت هي أصلا محاصرة بشكل كامل، فكان لابد من وصول مساعدات لهذه المناطق لابد أن تدخل إلا عن طريق النظام، وكان النظام للأسف دائما يؤخر وصول هذه المساعدات لهذه المناطق، وبالتالي يزيد من معاناة السكان الموجودين في هذه المناطق، فكان دائما النظام يستغل هذه المساعدات حتى يحقق مكاسب سياسية ومكاسب حتى على الأرض، مكاسب عسكرية، ويعيد السيطرة على بعض المناطق اللي فقد السيطرة عليها من بداية الثورة السورية حتى الآن، فكانت هي تستخدم كسلاح سياسي من قبل النظام ومن قبل روسيا ومن قبل كل حلفاء النظام لتحقيق أهداف عسكرية وأهداف سيطرة على الأرض، كانوا دائما يستخدموا هذا النظام.
According to a study done by the Center of Strategic and International Studies, the Syrian government diverted 51 cents of every international aid dollar spent in Syria in 2020. And since the earthquake struck the region, over 6,400 tons of international aid and 237 aircraft reached government-controlled Damascus. But in rebel-held northwest Syria, where the impact of the quake was felt the hardest, it took 5 days for the first UN aid convoy to arrive via the newly opened Bab al-Salam crossing. So why did it take so long for aid to arrive? Bab al-Hawa, an aid corridor from Turkey to northwest Syria and the only UN Security Council authorized border crossing, was severely damaged in the quake. The UN appealed to the Assad government to open additional cross-border access, but Syria, along with their ally Russia, rejected the use of other border crossings from Turkey, insisting that all aid must come via government-controlled areas. On the 13th of February 2023, 8 days after the quake, Assad finally issued a 3-month authorization for UN aid deliveries to pass through 2 more border crossings to the besieged northwest. But the damage had been done. The Syrian civil defense, the White Helmets, and locals were left to carry rescue operations alone, with volunteers using their bare hands to dig through the rubble. The slow humanitarian response left millions of people in freezing conditions without access to critical search and rescue reinforcements and life-saving aid. 6 days after the quake, UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths admitted that the UN had failed the people of northwest Syria. But for many Syrians, the apology was too little, too late.
أما بالنسبة لأخذ موافقة نظام الأسد من أجل إدخال المساعدات إلى شمال غرب سوريا، فالأمر صراحة هو مستهجن بشكل كبير، والموجودين في شمال غرب سوريا هن سكان مثلهم مثل أي مدنيين، مثل أي مدنيين موجودين حول العالم، هن بيستحقوا أن توصل لهم المساعدات بدون إهانة.
I would say the UN has failed at stopping other countries from politicizing aid. The way it was handled basically showed how the United Nations in its current administration and management gives far more weight to protocol as opposed to saving human life. You have jurists and legal experts and professional organizations such as Guernica 37 in the UK. You have the former Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs, and all of them are saying that you do not need a vote in the UN Security Council to deliver aid to deliver cross-border aid. This is in typical circumstances, let alone under such extraordinary circumstances with thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands of people trapped under the rubble.
Syrian activists, academics, and NGOs have called on the UN and the World Health Organization to stand up to Assad. They argue that international organizations are normalizing Syria by addressing the Syrian government and working with it.
You should be able to find a way to deliver aid to those who need it, as opposed to partnering with parties to the conflict. So what happens especially in regime-held areas, that aid is actually empowering the Assad regime. Much of UN's collaborations in regime-held Syria are actually with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which is basically a government institution after their internal laws were revised, and the Syrian Trust for Development, which is headed by Asma al-Assad, the wife of Bashar al-Assad.
Days after the quake, the Director General of the WHO, Tedros Ghebreyesus, caused an uproar on social media after referring to Assad as His Excellency in a quote tweeted by the WHO.
Even if you were to speak in a very statist manner, even if you were an international organization and words such as regime, words such as opposition weren't part of your vocabulary because of your bureaucracy or because of whatever ideological stance or methodological stance you take, you still don't refer to someone who has murdered over 600,000 people as His Excellency. But you can also say that with regards to international organizations, normalization was never really a concept because they never did break off ties with the Assad regime in the first place. In 2021, WHO elected Syria as a member of the executive board among other members for a period of 3 years. And this came at a time when the regime and its ally Russia were systematically targeting healthcare facilities in Syria.
I think the Assad regime simply understands how the United Nations works. He knows how to put pressure on them and get them to give concessions, and he has succeeded time and again. Overall, I think the international community has failed Syrians, especially in northwest Syria, and this applies to both unilateral aid and United Nations aid.
More than 12 years since the start of the Syrian conflict, and with over half of Syria's population displaced, the international community still doesn't know how to deal with Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, Syrians in the earthquake-hit region are still waiting for aid, for bodies to be retrieved, and for family members to be put to rest. The longer stakeholders and leaders play politics, the more civilians have to lose.